Thanks for the introduction. And today I'd like to talk about the study investigating the changes in brain and behaviors in children with lower levels of prenatal alcohol exposure. And for the disclosure, I don't have any conflict of interest. And also at the very beginning, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Cassie LaBelle, and also I'd like to thank all those lovely colleagues from the lab. And also just recently, our lab just opened this Instagram account named labelle.neuroimaging. So please feel free to follow and check some updates from the lab. And also I'd like to thank all the funding agencies I listed on the right side here. All right, so this is outline of my presentation. I'll talk about some background, the methods, and then go to the results, and finally give you some conclusions. All right, so at the background, at the very beginning, I'd like to talk a little bit about the prenatal alcohol exposure. So just like it means a mother drink alcohol during pregnancy. And then by many years of research and also by the instructions of many health institutions, there's no safe amount of alcohol consumption during pregnancy. And also alcohol as a teratogen, because a lot of studies have found a group of conditions or symptoms can occur in person with prenatal alcohol exposure. And this kind of like an umbrella term was named the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD. And then after this, many studies kind of like have been investigating the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure and all FSD on children's development. And generally, for the previous studies which focused on investigating prenatal exposure, they are generally investigating or enrolled heavy prenatal exposure. The heavy here means like mother drink more than 4 weeks per week during pregnancy, or some binge drink during pregnancy. And also, by the way, that so far is not very standard criteria for what is heavy and what is light. But however, generally we assume this kind of like heavy prenatal exposure. And by the studies, they found that the children with heavy prenatal exposure often have a series of like deficits in either physics, behaviors, or neuropsychological measurements, such as like the children with heavy prenatal exposure have lack of attention, have the deficits in motor functions or visual functions. And then by using a state-of-art like neuroimaging technique, so in my presentation, I'm gonna use this neuroimaging technique named MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, MRI methods. And by using this method, a lot of studies have found the disrupted brain structures and functions associated with children or adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure. So for instance, if you can see this is a figure of the brain. And for instance, in this study in 2008, they're using the technique named diffusion tensor image analysis to investigate the white matter fiber tracks all over the brain. And then they found that one of the measurements that measures the white matter microstructure features named functional anisotropy, or FA, present a decrease in children with prenatal alcohol exposure. So in this case, just remember that, yeah, this kind of like a measurement FA or functional anisotropy, like higher the FA, the better, like the better of the white matter microstructure features. But however, in this study, they found a decreased this kind of like microstructure features in children with prenatal alcohol exposure and all over the brain. And then if we move to the psychological or neuropsychological behaviors measurements, and a lot of studies also found the changes in the behaviors and cognitions and the neuropsychological measurements. So for instance, in this study on the left in 2020, in this study, they found that the children with PAE presented higher external lighting scores than unexposed controls. And in this case, the external lighting scores is a measurement of the external lighting behaviors. And if anybody familiar with this, it's a problematic behavior measures of outward behavior, such as aggressive, rule breaking, this kind of behavior. So higher scores means worse. So in this case, they found higher scores in children with prenatal exposure compared to unexposed controls. And a similar finding was also detected in this study on the right, and also in 2020, with a bigger sample size. And in this study, they look into the both internalizing and externalizing factors, and also in different domains. And also found that the children with prenatal alcohol exposure presented higher, like internalizing, externalizing scores, and also in different domains like attention, anxiety, depressed, and rule breaking, etc. compared to unexposed controls. And we already kind of like in the common sense or something like that, we know that there must be a link between our brain and those outcomes of those outcomes act like behaviors and neurological measures. So must be a link between them. And of course, there are also some studies try to investigate the relationship between the brain structures or functions and those internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And for instance, in this study in 2020, they found that this study is looking into the typically developing children, and they found a negative correlation here, negative correlations between the functional anisotropy, the measurement of white matter, and externalizing score. And the negative correlations here means that lower the score means better behavior leads to the higher functional anisotropy. Like I mentioned before, higher FA or higher functional anisotropy generally means better white matter microstructures. So this is kind of like, so in typical developing children, they have this kind of like relationship. And then this kind of thing can lead to my hypothesis or aims in the present study, is that in the present study, we want to investigate the children with PAE about the white matter microstructure as well. And also we want to investigate such relationships between the brain and internalizing all externalizing behavior scores associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. And then you might also notice that in my title, I also mentioned the lower levels of the prenatal exposure. The reason is that because in the present study, actually we selected the participants from an open access multi-site data set named the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, the ABCD study. So this study is a multi-site data set. They enrolled over 10,000 participants from 9 years old to 10 years old, healthy adolescents across over 20 sites in the United States. And during the enrollment, and they collect tons of modalities of neuroimaging data set, such as the diffusion tensor imaging data set I mentioned before, which is measurements of the brain white matter microstructures. And also they collected some data set related to the brain activities or brain functions, such as the resting state functional RMI data. And of course, they also collected tons of questionnaires or demographics of those participants, including prenatal exposure status, family history, and also the internalizing and externalizing measurements in their neurocognition battery, etc. So at the moment, you might notice that actually they have healthy adolescents participants in their data set. But however, after rescreening the prenatal exposure status of those participants, we found that actually there are a bunch of participants, many participants. Actually, they have different levels of prenatal exposure to different adverse substances, such as tobacco, marijuana, alcohol, etc. So in this case, we actually managed to select 135 participants who has at least recorded from the biological mother that they have drink alcohol during pregnancy. And you can see that the right levels of the prenatal alcohol exposure is kind of low compared to the previous prenatal alcohol exposure study. You can see the average drinks per week is 1 plus or minus 1, so it's kind of very low. But however, they are still exposed to alcohol during pregnancy as recorded from the questionnaires and those data sets. And also because they have really nice records of the prenatal exposure history. In this case, we also excluded the other exposure, adverse substance exposure, in those data, such as tobacco, marijuana, etc. So those participants only prenatally exposed to alcohol and no other substances, adverse substances. And another thing you might notice in the figure because they have tons of participants and really big data set, so we also managed to collect the well-balanced demographics for the unexposed controls. So we controlled both a lot of things like age, sex, family income, and maternal education, and to So we select the same number of the sample size with the children or adolescents with PAE. So those are the two groups we're gonna look into in the present study. And then, like I mentioned before, like in this case, we pick up some like white matter measurements from the diffusion tensor image analysis, like those measurements I listed here. And also on the other hand, we also collected, also not collect, we didn't collect. We selected the data set, all the measurements from this cohort related to the brain functional activity from the resting state functional MRI data set. And of course, also we selected the internalizing and externalizing domains or scores from the child behavior checklist scores from this cohort. And finally, we performed the Spearman correlation, or we check the link or relationships between the MRI measurements and those internalizing and externalizing scores, and try to find out what's happening in children with lower levels of prenatal alcohol exposure. Right, so at the very beginning, so here, I like to show you the results about the internalizing, externalizing scores or comparison between two groups. And you might notice that actually there are, if you like to check p-value first, like myself, you can see that actually across those internalizing, externalizing domains, the adolescents with PAE has very similar, those measurements compared to unexposed controls. And which kind of like makes sense because they're healthy, they are still healthy adolescents, and they have lower levels of prenatal alcohol exposure. But however, you might also notice this bold thing over there. But however, in one domain, in one measurements, the adolescents with prenatal alcohol exposure showed higher externalizing scores compared to unexposed controls. And in this case, higher scores means like worse problematic behavior. So higher scores, it's not good. So we still found this like results. So it's kind of like give our hint that even the children with like a lower level of prenatal exposure to adverse substances, there still might be some like potential risks for adolescents. All right. So this is the results of the internalizing externalizing scores. And then if we move to the brain or neuroimaging parts, and luckily by controlling a lot of things and also by using the multiple comparison correction and all those kind of like statistical criteria, we also found 5 regions. Those 5 regions showed a decreased fractional anisotropy in the PAE group in the adolescents with lower levels of PAE, prenatal alcohol exposure. And you can see those regions are located around like motor cortex here, which relate to the motor function, and also some areas related to the attention, like inferior parietal cortex, and also some regions located as a visual cortex, like occipital cortex, related to the visual function. And again, like those results also show that even the children with lower levels of prenatal alcohol exposure could also present this decreased functional anisotropy, like features like similar to the previous studies in the heavy PAE group. And here are some more details about those change, like change in those regions. And rather than the functional and fractional anisotropy I mentioned before, here shows like a very stringent like statistical levels. And then we can see actually there's also another levels or another aspects that relate to the white matter microstructures show some changes over those regions, like here and here. And by the way, in this case, you can see the red color here is PAE and the blue is controls. So you can see for the functional anisotropy, the PAE is lower than controls, but however, for the other measurements, they also show some differences. So those kind of things also make those kind of results more reliable or interesting that, the children with lower levels of PAE shows kind of like alterations or change in their white matter microstructure features. All right, so after those two analysis, one analysis from this internalizing external scores and one analysis from the neuroimaging or MRI measurements, and then we start to look into the relationship. And luckily, sorry, a little bit fast. And luckily, I also found the changed relationships between the internalizing or external behaviors and brain matter and brain structure measurements associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. So again, in this case, the blue color represents the controls and the red color represents the adolescents with PAE. And you can see the blue line here looks kind of like a decrease or negative correlations, which in line with the thing I just showed you before, that in the typical development children, the relationship between these white matter microfeatures and the external or externalizing scores are negative. But however, we barely see this kind of like relationship in the adolescents for PAE. You can see the red line here is kind of like a plane, a flat. So there's no such a relationship over there in the children or adolescents with PAE. So it means that if the link between those two also changed, like even under the lower levels of the prenatal alcohol exposure. So that's all the results I can show you here. So in conclusions, like we found the increased neuropsychological behavior measurements in adolescents with lower levels of PAE. And also we found the similar results in the brain structure measurements in adolescents with lower levels of PAE compared to the well-balanced demographics controls. And also we found the change relationships between the white matter or MRI measurements and the neuropsychological behaviors in adolescents with lower levels of PAE. So my study is kind of like real statement of at the beginning that there's no safe amount of alcohol consumption during pregnancy, and also kind of like make some like we should pay more attention, like a little bit more attention to the people or adolescents with these lower levels of prenatal exposure to adverse substances. All right, so that's all of my talk. I hope I didn't like overdo the time, and thank you for listening. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me through emails and my personal Twitter account. And also, if you're interested in like brain development, which was impacted by the prenatal environment, please feel free to check the presentation later in the conference by my colleagues and supervisors. And thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Xiangyu, for a terrific presentation. We are doing fine on time because we have a gap in between speakers. And so we have a few minutes for questions. I'll go ahead and watch the chat room. And Lonnie, if you can help me do that. If you have a question for Xiangyu, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and shout it out also. While we're waiting for that, I'll ask one follow-up question. So this ABC cohort, what a tremendous resource. And if I understood correctly, this low level of exposure was occurring throughout pregnancy. Do you have any way of probing the data more to look at early versus late exposure? I'm thinking about the early periods of pregnancy when many women don't know that they're pregnant yet. And would you be able to probe this data set to look at specific effects based on the timing of the prenatal alcohol exposure?
Well, that's a really good question. Actually, in the many prenatal alcohol exposure, they always look into the different exposure timing, like during different trimesters. Mm-hmm. But however, in the ABCD data, they only provided like the prenatal exposure. They have two questionnaires. One of the questionnaires is that like before they knowing their pregnancy, do you drink alcohol? Like, and also another question is after the knowing of pregnancy, they drink alcohol. Yeah, I kind of forgot to mention that in my study, in my presentation, we only included the mother who answered yes in the question of after knowing of pregnancy. So we excluded the data of the before knowing pregnancy participants. But it's a really good question, and definitely there are some studies always looking into the different level of prenatal alcohol exposure during different trimesters. But also you might notice, because I know you're working on a lot of people working on the animal model, it's kind of tricky to actually retrospectively check those information from the mothers. It's really, it's kind of really hard. And also, you guys might also notice that the participants is from 9 years old age, so it's also kind of like hard to let the mother to remember such a thing before like 9 or 10 years early, like beforehand. So it's kind of like tricky to see this. See this.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I do appreciate the complexities of carrying out research in human subjects. So that it's a tremendous effort. Lonnie, I thought I saw a hand up, but then it disappeared. Did I miss somebody?
Oh yeah, my hand was up, but you kind of took my question. I was going to ask about the different trimesters. So maybe I'll take some time to think of another one. But yeah, great talk. Great questions.
Okay. Other questions from the group?
I have a host of questions myself as well. Thank you so much. It was super interesting. I'm not as familiar with the literature on prenatal alcohol exposure, so some of my questions might be a little bit more basic or a little more general than your talk in particular. But I was wondering, so as you kind of already started to talk about the difficulties with assessing it, and especially because there is a bit of a stigma around prenatal exposure to alcohol as it's concerning women's use during pregnancy. So I wonder if that impacts the reliability of what you see in self-report, and also if the people who are reporting are more likely to report also substance use disorders, and if that is exclusion criteria then from the study.
Oh, that's a really good question. So I'll repeat. And the first question is about the reliability of the questionnaires due to the stigma and etc. Another question is about the exclusive of this kind of thing for the other prenatal exposure to different substances.
That and even like alcohol dependency, if that's like a common cause of why people are continuing to use alcohol during their pregnancies.
Yeah, that's a really both of them are really good questions, and also there are a lot of like many studies actually on both issues. I think you might heard more from the presentation later in this conference. And here at the moment, I just answer a little bit like for the first one, there are many studies investigating the reliability of those such retrospective questionnaires for the drinking alcohol during pregnancy. And yes, there are some studies to compare like a different way of like anonymous questionnaires or like a person-to-person questionnaires, even the phone calling questionnaires. Yeah, actually the smartphone should be something like this, not this anymore. But yeah, there's some studies to investigate such a thing, like both getting the information from the mother and also there's also a lot of papers. Remember this, even the paper name is something kind of like "Don't stigmatize the mother." Something title is something like this. In this research paper, like to make this kind of like a thing. But yeah, there's the reliability of the questionnaire is always kind of like difficult, especially for this kind of like study. And also that's kind of the thing. However, but yeah, that's why we try to, even for this ABCD study, because if you're familiar with like neuroimaging, actually for a lot of previous studies, generally people don't collect the prenatal exposure information for their human related study. But at least nowadays people are starting to collect those, like the ABCD data, they start to collect those, start to emphasize this kind of information. For me is at least is better than before. Yeah. And for the second question, I think you might heard the similar thing might be in my colleagues talk like Tiamo later about the COVID pandemic. Yes, and also actually there are some studies investigating the alcohol consumption during pandemic and during COVID-19. And this kind of thing also might actually bring some give more risk factors for such a thing. And like I said, even though it's not my domain, but for myself, I just focus on the neuroimaging part of the prenatal exposure. But yes, and there's a lot of factors going to influence such like alcohol use habits and this kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay, I'm watching the time. We've got a couple minutes left. Millar, would you like to take the last question? I see you've got your hand up.
Sure, thanks so much. And just a great talk, and you're doing very well managing this, both of you doing very well managing this extended discussion period. So thanks for indulging us. You're very impressive. You're doing a great job of holding court. So one question I had was just the definition of PAE. So in your study, you define it as 1 drink per week. So how standard is that? I'm just wondering, culturally, there might be different cultural norms around this and in different places about kind of what's permissible during pregnancy and what may not be. And so do you have some thoughts on what different, what different studies have said, or what this threshold might look like in different places?
Yeah, this again, like yeah, it's really nice. Another good question. A lot of people pinpoint a really important question in this field. Yeah, the average the number of drinkings in my data actually is collected from the ABCD data, and it's first it's just recording data from the cohort, and I cannot say whether it's normal or not, but however, it's still compared to because the children with heavy prenatal exposure can be diagnosed as a fetal FSD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and generally for those heavy PAE, prenatal exposure, the definition of something like this, like a binge drinking, like 7 drinks in a day, or even like 7 drinks per week, even like for several weeks during pregnancy. So the data I have from the ABCD cohort is still quite like low in the definition of like in the clinical definition. Yeah, and also for the culture and scene, the one thing I like to mention that actually the clinical the diagnosis policy, the social policy, and even the advertising for alcohol consumption, something like that. They're all kind of like different across different countries. I don't know like across different states, but at least there's a policy of alcohol advertising is different across different provinces in Canada. So there's kind of a big variation of cultures and ethics and everything. So it's a tricky part over there. So that's why at the very beginning, I like to mention there's very important to emphasize there's no safe amount of alcohol consumption during pregnancy. But however, across the population, across the whole world, there's a big variations about alcohol related policy, strategy, advertising, everything there.